Welcome, everyone. I'm Latrice Williams, Director of Membership and Communications at Grantmakers in Aging. I'd like to also welcome Amy Karamanpour, our conference event consultant, who is also on the call with us today. Many of you have been in touch with her regarding conference logistics, and if you have any questions after this, we'll make sure you have her contact information, or you can add any questions to our chat. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar training on reframing aging. And I will be brief because we have a full, informative, and engaging presentation today. Next slide. Okay, and at GIA, we see diversity, equity, and inclusion as core operational and philanthropic values, and aging is a core component of DEI. So at our events, we want to just ensure that the way we all talk about aging, as well as other aspects of people's identities, is respectful and aligned with those values. And reframing aging is a long-term social change endeavor designed to improve the public's understanding of what aging means and the many ways that older people contribute to our society. GIA is proud to have been involved in the collaborative that founded and launched Reframing Aging in 2014. And we remain actively engaged with our colleagues at GSA who lead the National Center to Reframe Aging. The National Center to Reframe Aging is the central hub for the movement. We continue to work closely with NCRA to ensure that we apply age-inclusive, bias-free language in our communications and help promote principles and tools to effectively frame aging issues. And to lead us in our discussion today, we've invited our dear friend Hannah Albers, Program Director of the National Center to Reframe Aging. She is trained as a national facilitator of the Reframing Aging principles. So Hannah, I thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Latrice. And as I get my screen sharing, I just want to say how excited I am to be here with you all. I first learned about reframing aging at a Grantmakers in Aging conference in Memphis, Tennessee. So that was my first introduction to this work, and I'm excited that all these years later, I have the opportunity to serve as a program director for the National Center. If you haven't already, please click the link in the chat to take a quick 3-question pre-test, and we'll return to those same questions at the end of our time together today. As Latrice mentioned, we have a robust agenda, so we're going to keep it energized. We have some opportunities for engagement, but we're going to be going over a little bit more of who the National Center is, and then explore some of the reframing aging principles. So why framing matters, some traps we want to avoid, strategies we want to advance, and begin the discussion of how we apply this to presentations specifically at the upcoming GIA meeting. And then we'll have opportunity for questions throughout, so keep engaged in the chat. As we spend time together today, just a few hopes that I have for our time together. Whether you're working from home or in an office setting, there's plenty of distractions that surround you as you're joining us for today's session. Do your best to be as present as possible. Ask questions. As I mentioned, we have a variety of ways to engage in today's webinar. But one of the primary ways is to ask questions. So be sure that you're using the chat function to be engaging and asking questions as we go. If I miss something, Alice and Latrice are there to help make sure that we come back to it. And then as we do some engagement, I always like to remind myself and those with me that silence is a good thing. I know that you're thinking. So as we have opportunity for engagement, we'll leave some room for you to do that thinking. Latrice, you explained the National Center so well, and we are so excited that GIA continues to be such a critical part and important partner in our work. We are the organization that leads the movement to reframe aging. We're dedicated to ending ageism by advancing an equitable and complete story about aging in America. And we do this by bringing together individuals, organizations, networks, collective impact groups to spread awareness of the implicit bias against older people and influence policies and programs that benefit us all as we age. As Latrice mentioned, the GIA is one of the partners in this work. This all started with a conversation about 10 years ago between some of the CEOs of the organizations you see on this slide. I am confident you all are familiar with Grantmakers in Aging, and I'm sure you are familiar with other names here. And these organizations came together and said, you know, we all have different vantage points in the field of aging. But how do we get beyond this shared barrier of ageism? How do we move the public to think more broadly, more accurately about what it means to grow older in the US? So they came together and funded the research that now informs all of the work that the National Center does. We do have funding support at a national level from these 4 philanthropic partners, and we also work with regional and local funders to support local initiatives that are building the movement in states and counties and cities throughout the US. As I mentioned, this work is research-based. We have an active relationship with the Frameworks Institute, who is the original researchers behind this work. And we continue to work with them to make sure that we stay up to date with the guidance and strategies that we teach about. So as we get started, I want you all to reflect, and no need to participate in the chat for this one, but reflect to yourself about where you've seen ageism, where you've experienced ageism, moments where you may have perpetuated ageism. And the last question is really what we're focused on today. What do we do about it? How do we start to shift our experience and understanding of what aging means? And this awareness is really important as we think about how we pivot and really change the culture around this. Researchers at the University of Michigan Center on Healthy Aging did a poll and asked adults age 50 to 80 what their experience was with ageism, and 82% said that they experienced one or more forms of ageism in their day-to-day lives. So if you said yes on any of the questions on the previous slide, or were thinking about these moments, you are not alone. There's many others who are experiencing ageism every single day. And to ensure we all have the same understanding, working definition of what I mean when I'm talking about ageism, we use the World Health Organization definition of this in talking about how ageism exists in several forms, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, and how ageism exists on multiple levels. So we think about interpersonal ageism, the interactions you have with another person, comments like, "Oh, you look great for your age," right? Compassionate ageism. So we hear this frequently referred to as elder speak, or where we see ageism show up in our systems, our policies, our practices, social norms, all that unfairly restrict opportunities simply based on someone's age. So you can think of forced retirement ages as an example there. And then we also see ageism self-directed, right? Where we turn inwards and we take all of this messaging that we've received throughout our life, and we might make a comment of, "Oh, I'm too old to do that," or "I'm too young. I don't have the right experience to do that," right? So where we see the ageism as self-directed. And all of that, all of those experiences are informed by the everyday messages that we see, right? Starting at an early age, we're hearing people tell jokes about age. We're seeing characters on TV make those jokes, watching late night television shows that rely on making jokes and stereotypes about age. We see advertisements, magazines, birthday cards, all of these were inundated every single day with these messages. And it really individually might seem rather minor, right? Minor incidents, but they're powerful in getting under our skin and how we understand what it means to grow older. And one of the things that makes this so sticky, that underlines ageism, is implicit bias, right? Also known as unconscious bias. These are those automatic assumptions that are informed by those everyday messages that we use to make sense of the world. But we also know that they, when we harbor these implicit associations, it causes us to have feelings and attitudes about other people based on characteristics such as age, as well as other characteristics as race, ethnicity, age, appearance, ability, for example. And one of the components of the research that Frameworks Institute did was found that simply making people aware and exposing them to an explanation of implicit bias actually reduced people's implicit bias. So we think about how powerful it is to talk about this and explain it for folks. All of that undercuts what we're all about at the National Center, which is how we frame our communications and the choices that we're making in our presentations, in our communications, in our conversations with others. So to level set a little bit, I just want to talk very briefly about what framing is. And really the idea here is that we are all communicators, whether it's in our professional job title or not. We are making choices subconsciously or strategically about what we want to emphasize, how we explain something, and what gets left unsaid. And the concept of framing is to be aware of the environment that we're communicating in so we can make those choices strategically. And this is really important when it comes to aging because of this divide that we see between those of us in the field and then the general public. So one of the first steps in the research was what we say map the terrain, right? So researchers interviewed experts like you to understand how do we in the field respond to these core questions, and then how does a broader public response to those same questions. And so you see this difference between the two, right? We in the field, when we're asked how we should approach aging, we think that we should embrace aging. We like to talk about the fact that we're all aging, and that good programs and policies benefit us all as we age, right? And that's more where we land. Whereas the public, their default is to really think of aging as a battle, something that needs to be fought. And another example of this bifurcation is the question of what can be done to ensure well-being in older age. We in the field know there's plenty to be done, right? That is why you're going to GIA to present, is to share what you know can be done to support well-being in older age. And we know that we're we live and breathe it every single day, right? And the public doesn't have that benefit. So when they're asked what can be done to ensure well-being, the response is, no, there's really nothing much we can do. It's just kind of inevitable, right? So this is the why of why framing is so important. And what this leads to when we're able to make these choices well, is that when we start to make these choices in our communications, whether that's through presenting or writing or a conversation with someone, is people start to model our language and the discourse starts to change. And that leads to people thinking differently. And ultimately, what we're after and what we want is to see policy support for programs and funding grow. So that is our ultimate goal. And you all, by coming today and helping us with this work, are contributing to that. So as I mentioned, as we're framing, one of the important things is to understand the landscape in which we're communicating. And we refer to this landscape as the public understanding. And so the researchers took those, how the public responds, and found themes in their responses. And so we bucket these themes, these ways of thinking, into two categories. One are traps to avoid. These are traps that get in the way of our message, right? They're these default patterns of thinking, these assumptions that the general public has when thinking about aging. And they're counterproductive to what we want them to be thinking about. And those traps are dominant, right? The traps in the red are the dominant ways of thinking that people have available to them when thinking about aging. In the blue, on the right side of the screen, you see strategies to advance. And these are patterns of thinking that the public has that are there. They're just a little bit more recessive. And so our goal is to share with you the strategies that you can use to and start to employ to ensure you're cueing those patterns of thinking that are helpful to our message and get people to where we want them to be, and navigate through the traps. So when we have more time, we go into each one of these buckets in a little bit more depth. I'm going to choose a couple that I think are particularly important as we're thinking about shaping our presentations. So as we go through some of these traps in this next section, be thinking about where you might see this show up in your presentation. And then when we get to the strategy section, we can start to think about how we pivot and make some different choices in that. One of the dominant patterns of thinking that we see in American culture, and this relates to aging and other areas, is the idea of individualism, right? And that's the idea that our life outcomes are primarily or exclusively driven by the grit, will, and drive that we choose or choose not to apply to our lives, right? It's about the financial planning decisions you've made, the health choices that you make, the lifestyle choices that you make. All important things, right? We want to ensure people are making good decisions in those areas, but we know that it's not that easy, right? That there's context that shapes, there's environmental conditions that shapes people's ability to do that. Is there a grocery store in your community? Is there a clinic in your community that's accessible? All of these things drive people's ability to make those choices. But for the public, it's this idea that, you know, the solution is in the individual action, and where the public is unable to think about the more systemic contextual factors that are at play there. The next trap that we want to avoid is the crisis trap. When the public thinks about solutions, or when we try to get them to think about what can be done, we're extremely fatalistic, right? When we think about if there's something that can be done to ensure well-being, the public reasons, well, it's just inevitable. You're going to deteriorate, you're going to decline as you age, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's the default that people have when thinking about aging. And this is caused, we cue this when we use crisis messaging, or which you see in phrases such as what you see on the screen of silver tsunami or demographic cliff, or starting with big statistics. And what the research found is that when we start that way, when we lead with that, and when we use crisis-laden messaging and metaphors that rely on these environmental disasters, it scares people away. If that's how you're going to start, my solution to a tsunami is to run the other direction. It's not to learn more about what you're trying to teach me. So when we talk about our solutions, we want to lead with our solution and not lead with statistics or big crisis messaging, because it scares people off and they stop listening to us. And there's a video on our YouTube site that talks about this a little bit more. So if you need a resource to take with you, I encourage you to watch that short 2-minute video. The third trap that we want to avoid is us versus them thinking. So in the US, we have a predominantly negative view of aging, as I've talked about. And we see this as people, and as we do, I've done it, and I catch myself every once in a while as well, when we identify ourselves as a separate social group, right? You can talk, my colleague Trish will say, you can talk with someone in their 80s who might not think of themselves as old yet, because old is 10 years older than yourself, right? And so there's this distancing that we default to when we talk about aging. And we see this primarily as we use they and them pronouns when talking about older people instead of us and we. And I encourage you to star this one, because I think it's one of the easiest traps to start with, because you can write your message, you can write your talking points, you can prepare your presentation as you would, and then go back and just scan for where you're using they and them, and where you could instead be using language like as we age, right? As we grow older. How can you incorporate us and we language in your messages instead? And then the final trap that I'm going to talk about is the super senior story. We see this as a common story in media, and marketers use it. And the idea that it's well-intentioned, the hope is that it puts forth a more positive vision of aging. The challenge with this, and what we see, is that it paints a picture that the only way to positively age is by doing extraordinary things in later life, or maintaining a youthful appearance. And most of the time, these stories focus on the individual choices someone's making, right? Which brings us back to that trap of individualism. So we want to tell these incredible stories, but we need to do that in a way that provides the context that's allowing that person to age so well. Right. So where I mentioned that as we were going through those, some of where we see those come up in presentations, I wanted to offer a more specific list for you to think about where these show up, and how we at the National Center work to ensure that we're not cueing these traps in our presentation. And as we continue, I have another slide for you that shows you, instead of using these, how we can use some strategies to pivot around these items. So take this as a note of, these are some of the ways and some of the phrases that we see show up in presentations, and we'll get to the slide that shows you what you should be doing instead. So the other bucket that we had in navigating public understanding was looking at strategies that we can advance. And there's a handful of strategies that, again, the public has patterns of thinking that are helpful to us. We just need to learn how to cue them. So a few things that we can start doing is using the building momentum metaphor to talk about aging as forward movement. The second thing we can start doing is explain what our society needs to look like, so that each and every one of us has what we need to live meaningful lives as we age, no matter our circumstances. And then third thing we need to start doing is to talk about experiences of frailty without relying on paternalistic and infantilizing language. We recognize we don't want it to be a Pollyanna story, right? Frailty is real, but there's ways we can talk about that without cueing paternalism. And then these last two really focus on solutions. So we want to highlight and put and lead with solutions, policy changes that will better support all of us as we age. So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of these strategies. The building momentum metaphor was a tested metaphor. It was one of the metaphors the researchers tested and found was effective. And the story that we're telling with this metaphor is to remind our audiences that getting older is a dynamic process that involves continual change, growth, acquisition of new knowledge, right? And as we age, we gather that momentum, we accumulate wisdom, we accumulate knowledge, we accumulate experiences, and that moves us forward. And it's a resource to our communities, to our families, to our neighborhoods, right? So you can feel the energy that's behind that. And this metaphor is effective because it moves people's attitudes on aging from the default of thinking very negatively and fatalistically. And it moves our thinking away from that us versus them trap that we can fall into. So one of the things with the National Center that we say is this is a strategy. It's not I'm not giving you the slogan that you need to use, right? The phrase that pays, but it's a strategy. So we can talk about the concept of building momentum, but we don't have to use those specific words. So I'm going to put in the chat a link, and I invite you all to brainstorm with me. What are some synonyms, images, or phrases that we can use that conveys the building momentum metaphor without needing to rely on that language? So if you click the link in the chat, it will take you to a website where you can brainstorm some of these phrases that we can use in place of the building momentum language explicitly. So click the link on the chat and I will bring up the brainstorm that you all are contributing to. So let's bring that up. So you should see a screen that looks like this if you've clicked on the link. And there you go. So we're seeing some responses here. I see increasing knowledge, dynamic, progress, growth, community engagement, contribution, collective impact. So I hope you start to feel the difference in these words and these phrases, the energy that's behind them, and imagine using that in your presentations, in your written communications. Vitality, experience, wisdom, gaining expertise. All of these are so great. So keep dumping ideas in there as they come to you, and I'll be sure to share this word cloud with Alice and Latrice so they can get it back to you. And we'll return to our presentation. Great. So in just a few moments, I'm going to ask Alice to pause the recording. For those of you who are watching the recording later on, we're going to share a research video. One of the components of the research that was done by the Frameworks Institute was on the street interviews. And they were asking folks what their thoughts were about aging and what we can do to ensure well-being in older age. And so this video shows before what their response was to some of those questions. And then the video, we don't see the interim, but the interim is the researcher using the building momentum metaphor to explain aging and asking, again, those same questions rephrased a little bit, but asking those same folks what they think about aging. So I'm going to share the video, and then I'm going to ask you all to contribute in chat some of your reflections from watching it. And Alice, before I go to the next slide, I'll just ask that you pause the recording so we can honor the research regulation that these folks agreed to with the recording. And as we do that, I invite you all to share some of your reflections in the chat. What were some of the reframed thoughts that people shared in the after examples that resonated with you? Something that stood out. What were some of the comments that stood out to you? There's the intergenerational engagement. Absolutely. And that's one of the comments that always stands out to me as well, is he was able, the last gentleman was able to think of something, right? And intergenerational examples are best. Yes, Susan, the last man is, I know it's a good way to end the video of, it's a beautiful day to get older. What a powerful reframe that is. Well, I hope I share that video because I think it's really powerful to share with you the impact that using some of these simple interventions has in the way people think. And again, that was just a short, very quick intervention on the street that the researcher shared with that individual. Imagine that being paired with the program, the solutions that you all have at your disposal, and what that could do to someone's shifting that perspective, Julie, as you mentioned in the chat. So I have to share an example with you as well of building momentum in practice. So this is one of my favorite examples to share. If there's someone from Boston with us, bravo. This example is from the Age Strong Boston, and they had an opportunity to rebrand a vital service in their community, and this is the transportation service. So before, it's something we're all familiar with. Hopefully you have a senior shuttle in your community or surrounding area. And when they rebranded, instead of referring to it as a senior shuttle, they put on the side of the bus there, transporting Boston's most experienced people. And what's so great about this example is I invite you to think about yourself standing at a corner at a bus stop and imagine which bus you would prefer to get on, one, so we can think about the impact that this has on the folks utilizing this important service. And then you can think about this bus going throughout the Boston community and how that split second changes the perspective of the Bostonians who are seeing this bus and how they might perceive the folks who are using that service, the visitors who are going to Boston to be a tourist, right? All of those small interactions. And the other thing that's really important about this example is it doesn't scream, hey world, I'm reframing aging, right? It's a subtle way and a really impactful way to talk about reframing aging. So the next strategy that I want to share with you is using the ingenuity value. And this is, again, another tested value that the researchers tested to see what value can we use that really gets people to think more productively about aging and what we can do. And the value that they tested and found was effective was ingenuity. And this is the idea that we're resourceful, we are creative people, we can solve big problems. When we come together, we can do that, right? That's the story we're telling with this value. And when we do that, what happens is that we move people away again from fatalism and us versus them thinking, because we're really improving this idea that something can be done. We have the ability to improve our community, right? To solve these big problems. We can do that. And we have a collective responsibility and a collective benefit in doing that. So the ingenuity value is really, really powerful for our work. And here are some examples of what that might sound like, or how we can cue that in our message. Thinking about new ideas, innovative approaches to improve how society supports older people and responds to aging. So some really good examples of what the strategies we can start to use in our work. And just like words, images are incredibly important to our work as well. And they also communicate about older people, right? So we need to be very strategic with the images that we're using in presentations specifically. So the Frameworks Institute, in partnership with AARP, did some research on recommendations when using images. And here is a summary of their findings. So when we use images, it's important that we're depicting older people with limited mobility as participating and engaged with others, instead of relying on those images where you see older folks slumped over or disengaged in their care. When showing older people using technology, we want to show images that signal comfort and competence in that, instead of the frustrated images that are popular in use. Again, returning to that super senior idea, we want to use images of older adults instead of the older adult image of someone jumping out of a plane. How can we cue the idea that older adults are engaged in the workplace, are contributing to the community, are volunteering in the community, instead of relying on these super senior images that we see. And again, continuing in that idea, images of older people in workplace settings, again, to cue that thought that, we are actively contributing to our communities, to our workplaces throughout our life course. That doesn't just end when you're 30, that continues throughout your life course. And we want to ensure our images are supporting that idea. And we want to use images that depict older people in positive settings and engaged in positive activities. Again, we tend to see a lot of images of older adults who are frustrated or angry, and we want to ensure we're not perpetuating the ideas that form when folks see those images. And then when possible, again, using images that are based on your target audience. And there's some really great stellar examples from many organizations that are starting to do stock photo campaigns that help with and support these 6 recommendations that come from the research. So be very thoughtful in the images that you use. And one of the other really important strategies is to always include a solution. And we say every good story has a powerful ending, and solutions are that for us. And that is why you're going to GIA. So this is something that should be lots of fun. And I'm going to invite you all to share about your solutions in just a few moments. But the reason that solutions are so powerful and so important is because it prompts that can-do spirit, right? Counteracting the fatalistic thinking, that fatalistic trap that we rely on, avoiding the idea that nothing can be done, really highlighting the collective responsibility and collective benefit to participating and getting involved or understanding an issue and what can be done about it. And when we talk about solutions, we want to be very thoughtful about how we're framing them to ensure that we're emphasizing the systemic structural nature of the solution and de-emphasizing the individualistic solutions that we sometimes see, because we want to avoid cueing that individualistic thinking. I'm going to share 2 examples from our partners. And there's links here, and I will share the links with you in the chat as well. But the first is, you can see, again, another example from a community. This one is from Worthington, Ohio. And they had an opportunity, they had an age-friendly task force. And this is a great example of how we can use different words, different language to talk about aging. And so these signs are in their town square at the main intersection of the square, so that everybody who's navigating through the Worthington community are exposed to this, right? Engage at every age, be thankful for the gift of age. And again, just these small interventions, you don't need to say you're reframing aging, but it really showcases the idea that we can use different language when talking about age. And then I also put the link in the chat to Beth Kowalczyk, who's one of our national facilitators and has done some really incredible work in reframing her language and policy and advocacy that she's done. And the story shares some of the successes that she's had that are attributable in part due to her efforts to reframe aging in her work. So I shared that example with you. Another really great example is from our partners at Live On New York, who have been working on applying reframing aging to their advocacy work. And more specifically in this, the last time that the New York City Council had a basically total turnover, that the Live On New York team trained folks to how we can shape our communications, our advocacy work, to ensure that age is on the agenda and that we can hold folks who were elected to City Council to their commitments during the election. So the full story about Live On New York is also in the chat. And now I want to hear your solution. So we're going to return to that same link that we used to brainstorm the, we're going to use the same link that we used to brainstorm on building momentum. And I'll put this back in the chat for you. And I'd love to hear what are the solutions you're presenting about at the GIA meeting next month. So I'm going to switch our screen that we're seeing so we can celebrate all of the wonderful work that you all are doing. So let's move over there. So I know one of the pieces that the National Center is interested in having conversation about at the GIA meeting is the importance of well-framed multi-sector plans on aging. I'm really seeing those documents as foundational and as similar to the style guides that we've had updated, seeing those documents as places that people will return to and continue coming back to. I see someone shared older workers are the fastest growing workforce and they need paid leave. Absolutely. Age-friendly health systems, fantastic. The age-friendly initiatives across the board are really great examples of the importance of framing. Anything else? Okay, leveraging technology to improve quality of life, fantastic. An underutilized resource when it comes to supporting older people. So I encourage you to continue sharing about that. I'm excited to learn more about the solutions that you'll share at the GIA meeting. And again, just a reminder, we have so many more. Creative aging, the role of arts engagement to foster social connections, educating nursing students, combating ageism from different Latin American countries. Fantastic. And these are, the reason I asked this is because, as I said earlier, you all have the solutions. You know what they are, and we need to ensure that we lead with those solutions to ensure that people understand them and then get to why we need to pay attention to it and the issue that's underlining that solution, but celebrating all of those that you shared in the chat. One of our resources is a quick start guide that summarizes the tips that we shared with you today. Instead of using these, try these. And instead of going through this in detail, I wanted to share with you this chart, which takes those traps that I shared earlier that we frequently see in presentations and gives you alternatives. So for example, instead of using general terms or categories of people such as older person, older adult, senior, etc., provide a specific age range. So if you are presenting on a research study or a program that serves individuals who are 75 to 84 years old, use that age range, or talk about older Canadians, American women 75 years of age and older. So we want to be as specific as possible when talking about the population you're referencing instead of relying on general terms. Another example is, as I've said multiple times, but I think it's really, really important, is leading with your solution instead of leading with the statistics. One of the primary traps that we see is folks leading with the by 2030, X number of millions of people will be over the age of 65, right? A true and important statistic just make it your third slide instead of your first slide. Right? So how can we be navigating through these traps in our presentations? And so take a screenshot of it. We'll make sure that you all have access to the slides and to the recording so that you can take this guidance with you. And then as we think about and kind of summarizing what we've talked about today, if we return to thinking about the you say, they think problem that we started with, we can see that when we are able to frame well and make these strategic choices, you can imagine what saying something such as "we are all aging," what that cues for the public, and the benefit that has to our message. So as we wrap up, I invite you all to think about how you and your work can contribute to the Reframing Aging ecosystem. Share this graphic because I think it's really powerful that there's these key areas and networks that we want to be engaged in. And then there's all of these ripple effects that come from that. So be thinking about where you are situated professionally, but also personally. What are the local community centers, local house places of worship that we can begin to just, again, these small interventions, the one conversation with someone that you have, and how we can support that. There's a variety of resources on the National Center website. One of the resources I wanted to point out to you is that we have been successful in updating the age-inclusive language guidance and these 3 style manuals. So as you're working on adapting this in both your presentation, but in other areas of your work, know that you have style guides supporting you in the reason for this being so important. And there's resources, as I mentioned, on our website that help you apply this to your work. So the Quick Start Guide, we have an online learning center that gives you even more in-depth tools, a newsletter that goes out every other month, the Frame of Mind videos that were on some of the earlier slides that are 2 minutes, short glimpses into these strategies that we've talked about. So I have my second to last piece that I am asking you to do is you can minimize your Zoom screen if you'd like, but pull up your calendar app, whether this is on your phone or your computer, Outlook or Google, whatever you use to schedule time for yourself. Go to October 10th, which is a week before the GIA meeting begins, at 9 a.m. in your local time, and create a calendar appointment with the subject line that says, "Review my GIA presentation to ensure it's well framed." And I will put in here in the chat the message that you can include in that has links to resources and our email if you have any questions as you go forth and do that. And a bonus is if you make this a recurring calendar appointment monthly as a reminder to yourself that you should be doing something, checking the most recent presentation that you've formed, the most recent piece that you've written, a section of the web page that you manage, to ensure that you've incorporated at least one of these strategies in that work. So create your calendar appointments. And as you do that, Latrice, I'm happy to pass it back to you to share any follow-up information, and we can take the last few minutes here for questions.
Thank you, Hannah. Yes, if anybody has any questions that they'd like to add to the chat, I think someone did ask if the slides will be available, and I think that is correct, Hannah, and we will send out an email to everyone with the recording as well. But if there are any questions that anyone has right now that they would like to ask of us, that would be fine. We have a couple of minutes. We want to, again, Hannah, I want to thank you. I'll just personally say for myself, I'm in the facilitator training right now for reframing aging, and I learn a little bit each time, and I learned some more today, Hannah, and you even threw in some surprises that I think I want to be able to use the next time myself and use in my presentation. So I do thank you for that. I wanted to remind everyone, all presenters, if you have not registered yet, please do so at our conference. And wanted to, oh, we do have another question in the chat real quick. Can you repost the slide with the solutions-oriented page? Do you have that? Can you do that, Hannah or Alice, if you're?
I can. If I let me know if I get to the right one, but I think you're looking for this one. Is that correct, Susan?
It's that solutions. Let's see. Yes, that is the correct one. Oh, did it go away? Because I know sometimes when we do presentations, we like to do screenshots and capture that. That's great. Yeah. Julie asked, can you also post a link to the RA Useful Tools?
Yes, absolutely. I'd be happy to share that link in the chat. Make sure. And Alice, I can return the screen to you. So I know I took from the slides that you were sharing.
Wonderful. Well, we thank everyone again for engaging with us and participating and joining us. And we will send out our contact information, Amy's contact information, Hannah's contact information, mine and Maria. And we will definitely see you all in October. Thank you so much. You all have a great day.